Welcome to HAWK MOOR, the unofficial history of Dungeons & Dragons, Greyhawk, Blackmoor, Gary Gygax, and Dave Arneson. I am author, researcher, and game designer Kent David Kelly. If you enjoy this video series, please consider buying a PDF or paperback version of my book, HAWK MOOR, Book 1, The Dragon Rises. See the links below in my description of this video. This is HAWK MOOR Episode 3, Before Greyhawk, Castles in the Distance, covering the years 1963 to 1969. Before Greyhawk, Castles in the Distance. Becoming intrigued by the limitless potential of the Hexagon game boards in Gettysburg, Gary was apparently the first person to inquire with Avalon Hill concerning the availability of blank hex sheets for new map designs. Gary wanted 5 sheets for the creation of custom gaming maps, presumably so that he and Don Kay would be able to playtest the other battles of the Civil War. It is not known if these early maps still exist, but a lifelong precedent was certainly set by Gary's plans. The path was clear. The desire to create games for a living struck me in the early 1960s, he once wrote. Gary would continue to create hundreds, if not thousands, of similar game maps over the next 40-plus years. Incidentally, the person he wrote to in 1963 to acquire those hex sheets from Avalon Hill was one Mr. Tom Shaw. Much later, in 1973, Gary would invite Mr. Shaw to consider his own game called Dungeons & Dragons for publication by the Avalon Hill Game Company. Tom Shaw's lack of a concrete answer may have convinced Gary that he needed to found his own game design company so that he could finally fulfill his dreams. Following Gettysburg, Gary discovered H.G. Wells' Little Wars, as well as Fletcher Pratt's Naval War Game in the 1960s. His copy of Little Wars was loaned to him by a friend, and in 1976 he would devise a magazine of the same name, Little Wars, devoted to the subject of historical miniatures gaming. Also in the 1960s, perhaps around the second half of 1968, Gary became involved with a fascinating and groundbreaking play-by-mail PBM science fiction wargame. This was entitled War of the Empires. The original War of the Empires game was invented by Mr. Tullio Proni, and it involved, as Gary defined it, quote, a universe-wide power struggle between two socially hostile groups. On the one hand was the greatest empire, a monarchy aristocracy with dreams of binding every habitable planet to the throne. Opposed to this colonialist empire was the League of All Worlds, basically a confederation of all planets, systems, and multi-system governmental forms wishing to resist the expansion of the empire. Mr. Proni served as the master computer, parsing the many move requests received from the players by mail, and then dictating the outcome of the many disparate results. The game was played in the blind, meaning that players were at the mercy of calculated guesswork due to limited reconnaissance and the play-by-mail engendered fog of war. Moves and their residual aftermath were all reported by Proni in a short-lived fanzine entitled The War Report, beginning in February of 1967. This game was a deliberate exercise in confusion. Conflicting attempts at colonization upon the most desirable and resource-rich planets would inevitably lead to conflict. and the pulses of simultaneous movement, combined with haphazard reconnaissance in the form of reports from inferior scout ships, would quickly devolve into entertaining chaos. The best players, it seems likely, would be the ones who could patiently wait for two or more rivals to nearly wipe each other out over a particularly desirable world. A savvy lurker fleet crews could then sweep in as saviors and claim the ill-won prize. This game would probably also have encouraged a certain degree of metagame communication between players, in terms of treaty declarations or proposed trade agreements or even pronouncements of intended territory, provided the community had ever grown sufficiently to support such derivative communiques. But despite this game's many promising innovations, the time-consuming referee role was dropped by Mr. Proney for unknown reasons during the spring of 1967. The dozens of players were left in the hopeless dark of the void as soon as the decisive proclamations from the omniscient-seeming master computer lapsed into static and silence. A while later, Gary became interested in this game's mysterious legacy. He tried for many weeks in early 1969 to get a written response from Mr. Proney to determine if the interstellar campaign would ever continue, but there was no answer forthcoming at all. Around the spring of 1969, Gary, quote, took the bull by the proverbial horns and went to work on the project, which seems to indicate that he started running War of the Empires as the master computer himself, with or without Mr. Proney's regards. Gary expanded this game into a larger and more complex system, and then he encouraged people to send in moves via mail once again. This time, mail was to be directed to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. He even published a successor fanzine called The New War Reports in April and May of 1969, so that the game might take hold and potentially spread afar by way of positive word of mouth, or perhaps even gaming fanzines. A small ad appeared in the General magazine as well. If you're interested in space warfare, it read, certain issue, meaning heirs, of the Galaxian, a zine of the time, have printed rules to a game designed by Tullio Proney, pitting members of the greatest empire and the League of All Worlds against one another in one tremendous holocaust. To find out how you can join either of these two factions, contact Gary Gygax, 330 Center Street, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, 53147. A form will be sent that will be the basis for your potential rating as determined by the master computer. A third issue of the New War Reports appeared in early September, when the campaign had blossomed to include forces controlled by over 60 players, the most ever in the game's existence. Gary's eager successor in the project, Bill McDuffie, kept this new fanzine going for another year, but the game campaign again fizzled out, likely due to the colossal amount of time-consuming calculations and minutiae which required constant tracking. Without such work on the part of the Dungeon Master-like master computer, it would be impossible for anyone to keep the Starfarers' battles ongoing, accurate, timely, and fair. Mr. McDuffie may have succumbed to this fatigue as well. Another hard-working and creative gentleman named Alan Lucian, later of Tomb of Horrors fame as we shall see, tried to summon the game's third Phoenix-like incarnation in late 1971. But alas, all that remained were ashes. The players were weary of the on-again, off-again nature of turn parsing and the ever-sporadic battle reports. By then, Gary reported, participants had undoubtedly lost both interest and faith. Nevertheless, in daring this endeavor in game mastery, Gary had learned a lot, not only about speculative fiction game design, but also about campaign game logistics, as well as referee-driven mass combat and creative tactics to assist in handling collaborative parties comprised of many allied players. These lessons, supplementing his numerous prior experiences in wargame design, would serve him well in future years when he would be running dozens of eager players through his own game campaign, a new speculative fiction setting which would soon become known as the world of Greyhawk. Many other unusual games appealed to Gary as well, but perhaps the most significant game of this era, which had a profound influence on the future creation of Dungeons & Dragons, was a medieval battle scenario. It was created by a hobby shop owner named Henry Bodenstedt, and this game was entitled The Siege of Bodenburg. This game was published as a serialization in issues of Strategy and Tactics magazine beginning in July of 1967 and eventually completed by the issue of that December. The Siege of Bodenburg was meant to be played with toy medieval soldiers. Henry, as designer, had a vested interest in encouraging his readers to buy the model elastilin plastic castle and soldier figures required to play his game. And why was that precisely? Why, because Henry could provide the full needed sets to any interested buyers. He worked hard to import the toy figures from Germany and to make them all available to North American customers. The Siege of Bodenburg game itself features archers, knights, arquebusiers, gunners, and catapults. Interestingly, each unit has a combat value indicating how many hits that unit can take before being killed, an early example of a game concept we now know as hit points. The huge castle itself, required to play Siege of Bodenburg, was part of the Hauser, Elastilin, Fortin, and Castellan series. To this day, the castle is still an impressive piece of work. This miniature is actually about 2 feet square, featuring the castle's entire bulk embedded high upon a craggy hill. A drawbridge crosses over a partially encircling moat. It leads into a gatehouse barbican and thereon into a small rising courtyard. A great tower and a few colorfully roofed fortifications complete this elaborate piece. And this is, once again, a spectre echo of the future silhouette of Castle Greyhawk. The Siege of Bodenburg scenario surrounding this castle, as outlined in the Strategy and Tactics articles, involves the besieged forces of one Count von Boden waiting for winter supplies. The Count's forces, weakening with hunger, are suddenly assaulted by a horde of Turks and Huns. In the skirmish and siege game which follows, each toy figure represents a single man. In other early war games, a single unit would often represent 20, 50, or even 100 men or more, which tended to make the determination of casualties a rather impersonal and abstract affair. The Siege of Bodenburg, however, employed a one-to-one representation, with one figure representing a single fighting man. This intimate scale, especially when coupled with the detailed Hauser soldier figures, creates an intense air of personal investment and loss as every single casualty takes place. Each imaginary soldier, however anonymous at the beginning of the game, is soon given his own story, his own dire tale to tell. Every wound would be an event, an almost cinematic occurrence. This unusual game mechanic, while now commonplace, would have a profound effect on Gary Gygax. It would also have a profound effect on his fellow medieval wargamer, a man named Jeff Perrin. Some years later on, these two would be influenced in their profound choices in game design for a new game entitled Chainmail. Outside of this key innovation of scale, a full game of the Siege of Bodenberg can be a rather dragging and dull affair. The rules are effective and detailed, yet rather blasé. Admittedly, this is from my own biased 21st century perspective. There are still some intriguing asides hidden away beneath the doldrums, however. Interesting details include a sally gate from which castle defenders can rush out to attack the besiegers at their own peril. There are also interesting morale and scatter rules, simulating wounded men in panic. And there is also the rather grisly option of allowing starving knights to sacrifice their horses to add to the desperate castle rations. Gary read these rules with great interest, and later, in the summer of 1968, as we shall see, he got to play the game with elastilin miniature figures for the very first time. In later years, Gary would pay respectful tribute to the Siege of Bodenberg by modeling the ruined moat house of Greyhawk in his own work. This would be Dungeon Module T1, The Village of Hamlet, released in 1979. The moat house was modeled almost directly upon Castle Bodenberg's scenario and floor plan. The Fortin and Castellan model is almost exactly represented by that module's map of the moat house ruin, and the history of Greyhawk itself pays homage to the battle. For example, in Module T1 we can read as follows. Only after the battle which destroyed the main armies of the Temple of Elemental Evil had ended, was attention turned to this place, the moat house itself, situated to the east of Hamlet. A detachment of horsemen and footmen with a small siege train came to the marshlands to lay this castle low. The common folk from miles around came to help, and so the moat house was surrounded, cut off, and battered into extinction. This game would later inspire Jeff Perrin to make his own medieval miniature rules, and a passing mention of soldiers running through underground passages to reinforce parts of the castle may have been one of the kernels which would later get Dave Arneson's and David Megary's minds running about the potential for medieval dungeon adventures. Many other games would follow after the Siege of Bodenberg, several of Gary Gygax's own devising. His interest in creating and playtesting rules for medieval miniatures and siege warfare, already a strong inclination, would be greatly intensified by his next wargaming experience. This would happen during a gaming convention of his own creation, the now legendary Geneva Convention, which we have shortened to the name Gen Con. Gary's founding of Gen Con would involve not only a business venture, it became his personal playground. And to the good man's credit, he would always be happy to share that playground with anyone else who shared his sense of fun and his thirst for untold adventures. We will talk about Gen Con and many more things in the near future. But for now, this brings an end to Episode 3 of HAWK MOOR, Castles in the Distance. I will return again to explore the history of Dungeons & Dragons with you all in the near future. Until then, enjoy your old school gaming with family and friends. I will see you next time. Thanks for watching, and take care.